the summer Mabel Thorn bought the flooded quarter section on the edge of Cutbank Flats. People in Harwick said she'd lost her mind along with her husband. They weren't entirely wrong about the timing. Gideon had been dead 11 weeks when she signed the papers. The ink was still damp when Walter Picard, the man who'd sold it to her, shook her hand with something between pity and relief. He'd been trying to move that land for 3 years. Nobody wanted a field that sat under 18 inches of water every spring and smelled like iron and cattail rot until August. Mabel was 26 years old. She had $412 left in an account at the Harwick Cooperative Credit Union, a 1949 Ford half-ton with a cracked windshield, and a 3-year-old daughter named June, who still asked for her father at bedtime, with the calm persistence of someone who hadn't yet learned that some questions don't get answered. The land cost her $380. She kept the rest. People talked, of course. In Harwick, talking was as much a part of the season as seeding and harvest. Dorothy Picard, Walter's wife, mentioned it at the ladies' auxiliary meeting, and by the following Tuesday it had spread through the grain elevator, the hardware store, and the back booths at Olson's Diner, where the older farmers gathered on Thursday mornings to drink coffee and say what they actually thought about things. "That Thorn woman bought the cutter slough," said Rhea Burley, who farmed the section directly north of it. He said it the way you'd say someone had driven their truck into a ditch deliberately. "Heard that," said Floyd Dempster. "What's she planning to do with it?" Nobody knew. What Mabel was planning was not the kind of thing that translated well into conversation at Olson's Diner. It lived mostly in a brown notebook she kept in the glove box of the Ford, filled with her own handwriting and a handful of sketches she'd made in the evenings after June went to sleep. She'd been keeping that notebook since the spring before Gideon died, back when they'd still been talking about what they might do with land of their own someday. Back when someday still felt like a direction. Gideon had been a quiet man, quiet in the way that some men are quiet because they're watching and thinking, rather than because they have nothing to say. He'd grown up on the Alberta prairie and knew soil the way other men knew machinery. He could pick up a handful of dirt, rub it between his fingers, and tell you what it had been through. Wet years, dry years, what had been grown on it, whether it had been worked too hard or left to rest. He'd been the one who first pointed out what most people missed about the Cutter Slough. The problem wasn't that the land flooded. The problem was that nobody had ever thought about where the water went after. When Mabel bought it, she started learning. She drove to the provincial library in Lethbridge 3 times that fall, leaving June with her neighbor Edith Gould while she sat at the reading room tables with hydrology textbooks and old agricultural surveys spread out in front of her. She wrote things down in the brown notebook. She asked questions of the 2 extension officers she could get on the phone, and when they were politely skeptical, she wrote down what they said too, and then kept reading, what she was looking for, and what she eventually found, in a 1941 survey report that had been filed and apparently never read again, was confirmation of what Gideon had suspected. Under the Cutter Slough, below the layers of clay and peat, there was a gravel lens running almost a quarter-mile east to west, a natural channel. And the water that flooded that field every spring wasn't just sitting there doing nothing. It was moving. Slowly, through the gravel, downward. It was recharging something. The winter she spent on borrowed time and careful budgeting. She was staying in a 2-room house on the south edge of Harwick that she rented from Gordon Fry for $18 a month. It was small and drafty, and the pipes froze in January, but it had a good wood stove and a yard where June could play, and Mabel had grown up in a house not much better, so she didn't complain about it. She worked. She took in sewing when she could get it, and she did bookkeeping 2 afternoons a week for the Harwick Feed and Supply, and in the evenings she planned. She ordered seed catalogs. She corresponded with a man in Tabor who had experimented with drainage tile on similarly wet land. She received a letter back with more questions than answers, but she kept it. In Harwick, the talk continued at a low murmur through the winter, as it always did when there wasn't much else to occupy people. Most of it was sympathetic in a general way. Gideon had been liked, and there was a certain goodwill extended to Mabel by association, but underneath the sympathy was a steady current of doubt. Rhea Burley said the slough would never be productive land. He said it with the confidence of a man who has watched a problem long enough that he's stopped seeing it as a problem and started seeing it as a fact. His wife Agnes said she felt sorry for the little girl. A man named Selby Harwick, no relation to the town, who ran the largest operation in the area, 3 sections of dryland grain north of the highway, said he'd offered Gideon fair money for that quarter before he died, and Gideon had been too stubborn to take it. Now his widow's bought it herself, Selby said, shaking his head. Some things are just in the blood. He didn't mean it kindly. The first spring, Mabel didn't try to farm the land. She watched it. She drove out every week when the roads allowed, sometimes with June bundled in the cab beside her, sometimes alone. She walked the perimeter in rubber boots. She noted where the water stood deepest and where it drained first. She drove stakes into the ground at measured intervals and checked them after rain. She sketched the drainage patterns in the brown notebook with a pencil. What she saw confirmed what the survey had described and added to it. The northwest corner drained fastest. The southeast corner held water longest, and that corner was also where the cattails grew densest, which meant the soil underneath was richest. There was a slight natural grade running southwest that nobody had ever used because nobody had ever thought to. She began to see the land not as a flooded field, but as a system. Water coming in, water moving, water going somewhere. The question was whether you could work with that movement instead of against it. That fall, she hired a man named Clem Duval to help her dig. Clem was 62 years old and had spent most of his life doing drainage work across southern Alberta. He was hard to find and harder to afford, but he came recommended by the man in Tabor, and when Mabel explained what she was trying to do, Clem sat quietly for a long moment and then said he'd come out and look. He looked for half a day, walked every inch of the low ground, poked a metal rod into the soil in a dozen places to feel what was underneath. Then he sat on the tailgate of the Ford and drank coffee from a thermos and told Mabel what he thought. "It can be done," he said. "It won't be cheap and it won't be fast." "I know that," Mabel said. "The tile needs to run here, here, and here." He showed her on her sketch. "You've got the grade for it if you cut a small swale along this edge. Then you need a collection basin here, not too large, and from there you either pump or run gravity to wherever you're going." "I want to run it to a holding pond," Mabel said. "Here." She pointed to the lowest corner of the adjacent land, a strip of unclaimed scrub she'd found in the county records, unmaintained crown land that abutted her property to the south. "I've applied to lease it." Clem looked at where she was pointing. "That's a lot of work." "I know." He drank his coffee. "That pond," he said. "What are you thinking?" "Irrigation," Mabel said. "Dry years." Clem was quiet for a moment. The wind came in from the northwest the way it always did at that time of year, flat and cold, and carrying the smell of early frost. "People around here don't irrigate," he said. "Not yet," said Mabel. They dug in the fall after harvest, when the ground was workable. Clem knew a man with a tile-laying machine that could be rented, and Mabel had spent the summer building enough of a stake. Through the sewing and the bookkeeping, and one well-timed sale of the breeding pair of shorthorns she'd inherited from Gideon's uncle, to pay for it. It took 3 weeks. It was cold, dirty, unglamorous work, and on several days the temperature dropped far enough that they had to stop early to keep the clay from freezing in the wrong positions. Mabel worked alongside Clem and his nephew every day, doing what she could do, and staying out of the way when the machine was running. Ray Eberly drove by twice on the road that ran along the north edge of the land. The first time he slowed down but didn't stop. The second time he pulled over and watched for a while from inside his truck, and Mabel could see him watching, but she didn't walk over. He drove away without getting out. Word got back to her through Edith Gould, who knew everything that happened in Harwick and delivered the information without editorial, which Mabel appreciated, that Selby Hartwick had said the drainage scheme was a waste of money that would end up belonging to the bank within 2 years. Mabel wrote that down in the notebook too, not out of bitterness, just because she was keeping track. June turned 4 that October and asked for a dog, and Mabel got her one, a border collie cross from a litter out at the Gould farm, small and black and white, which June named Puddle with the absolute authority of a child who has never considered that name's required justification. Puddle followed June everywhere and slept on her feet, and on the evenings when Mabel sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open and the radio on low, she could hear June in the next room talking to the dog in the earnest, detailed way children talk to animals, explaining things. It was a good sound. The second spring, the tile drained most of the field. Not all of it, The southeast corner still held water into June, and Mabel would later add a secondary line to address it. But the northwest two-thirds drained off in April, and by the third week of May, it was dry enough to work. She put in oats on the first 20 acres, partly because oats were forgiving, and partly because she was still learning how the soil would respond to cultivation. She seeded light and watched. The oats came in better than anything she'd grown on rented ground. The soil in that field, she would understand later, had been building up organic matter for decades under the cattails and the standing water. It had never been depleted by continuous cropping. It was, in a way nobody had thought to consider, rested land, ready land. The drainage hadn't improved it so much as it had uncovered it. She didn't say this to anyone in Harwick that fall. She sold the oats quietly, paid Clem what she still owed him, put a small amount aside, and spent the winter planning the next phase. The holding pond was finished that second fall, smaller than what she'd eventually want, but functional. It sat at the south end of the leased strip, fed by the gravity line from the collection basin. By spring it held enough water to run a small pump. She bought the pump secondhand from a farm auction near Picture Butte. June came with her and spent the auction eating a sandwich and organizing rocks by size in the gravel lot while Mabel bid on it. She got it for $11. The third year was when people started noticing. The spring that year was dry, not catastrophically, not yet, but the kind of dry that made experienced farmers check the sky more often and talk about the 30s in the slightly too casual way. People discuss something that genuinely frightens them. The snowpack had been thin. April came in with wind and no rain. Mabel irrigated her expanded field from the holding pond. It wasn't a large operation. A portable aluminum pipe system she moved by hand every 2 days. But it meant her crops kept growing through May, while the dryland fields around her went tight and pale at the edges. Ray Burley's oats germinated and then stalled. The soil was too dry to let them root properly. He was watching the sky the same way everyone else was. In late May, Agnes Eberly came to the door of the house on the south edge of Harwick. Mabel opened it, and Agnes stood there with a look on her face that was hard to categorize. Somewhere between embarrassed and determined, which Mabel recognized as the expression of someone who has decided to do a thing before they've fully talked themselves into it. "I was wondering," Agnes said, "if I could ask you something about what you've been doing out at the Cutter place." Mabel held the door open. "Come in," she said. "I'll put on coffee." Agnes sat at the kitchen table, where Gideon had never sat, and looked at the brown notebook that Mabel set to the side but didn't close, and she asked careful, intelligent questions, and Mabel answered them. June came in halfway through and climbed into the chair beside Mabel without being asked, and puddles settled under the table, and the kitchen smelled like coffee and the wood smoke that always got into everything in that house. And Agnes Eberly wrote some things on a piece of paper she'd brought. When she left, she said, "Ray's going to ask you himself. He's just slower about some things." "That's all right," Mabel said. Ray came the following week. He stood in the doorway rather than sitting down, the way men sometimes do when they want to keep an interaction shorter than it turns out to be. He asked about the drainage tile. He asked about the holding pond. He asked about the pump. Then he asked, with the particular difficulty of a man unaccustomed to the question, if Mabel thought there was any way to replicate what she'd done on land that drained differently. "Probably," Mabel said. "It depends on what's underneath. How do you find out what's underneath?" "You dig a test hole and you look," Mabel said, "or you get someone who knows how to read the surface signs." Ray was quiet for a moment. "Could you come out and look?" "Yes," Mabel said. "I can do that." The summer stayed dry. By July it was clear this wasn't a one-season correction. The rain that normally came in June had been half of average. The wells on the highest ground were starting to come up slow. Selby Hartwick's dryland operation was looking at a partial write-off. His 3 sections of grain had gone hard and uneven, the heads thin and scattered in the way that meant the yield would be a fraction of what it should be. Mary's field was green. She wasn't trying to make a point. She was trying to grow food and pay her bills and keep the ground she'd worked for in a condition that would serve her next year and the year after. But the green field existed regardless of her intentions, and it was visible from the road, and people drove past it and looked. A man named Orrin Bast, who ran the feed store on Main Street and whose family had been in Harwick since before it was a town, stopped her one morning when she was picking up supplies. "I've been watching what you've done out there," he said. Mabel waited. My brother-in-law has 20 acres on the creek bottom that's been a problem for years, Orrin said. Too wet to plant early, too dry in August. Similar situation to what you had. He's been thinking about tile drainage but didn't know where to start. Tell him to call Clem Duval, Mabel said. Clem's the one who knows drainage. I just knew enough to hire him. Orrin nodded. But you knew to look at the land differently. Mabel picked up her bag of fence staples. Somebody showed me how, she said. I just wrote it down. Selby Harwick came to her in August. She didn't expect it. He was not a man who came to people. People came to him, or that was how it had always been in Harwick. He was 61 years old, third generation on land his grandfather had broken, and he had the bearing of a man who had never seriously considered that he might be wrong about anything. But he came, alone, in his good truck, and sat in the yard rather than coming to the door. And when Mabel came out, he looked at her the way people look when they've had to do a significant amount of private rearranging before arriving somewhere. I need to understand what you've been doing out here, he said. Mabel sat on the porch step. June was inside with Puddle, and she could hear the radio playing through the screen door. What part? She said. The water part, Selby said. The holding pond, Mabel told him. She was direct and specific, the way Gideon had been direct and specific, without softening the parts that had been hard or the mistakes she'd made in the first season. She told him about the survey she'd found in Lethbridge. She told him about the gravel lens. She told him about Clem and the tile and the dry spring that had proved it out. Selby listened. He didn't interrupt, which surprised her a little. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. I said some things, he said finally, about you, about this place. I know what you said, Mabel said. I was wrong. She didn't say anything to that. She didn't need to, and she knew it, and she thought Selby knew it too. I've got surface sloughs on the west quarter that I've always just written off in the spring, Selby said. Never thought to think about them differently. They might be worth looking at, Mabel said. Would you come out? She thought about it for a moment. Not about whether she would go, but about what it meant that he was asking. What it meant that the man who had told anyone who'd listened that she'd lose this land within 2 years was sitting in her yard asking for her help. I'll come, she said, but call Clem Duval too. He's the one who'll tell you what's actually possible. The autumn brought enough rain to ease the worst of it, but not enough to let anyone forget what the summer had been. The conversations at Olson's diner changed in a way that doesn't happen quickly, the way a river changes course. Slowly, then suddenly, and then everyone acts as if it had always been going that way. People talked about water differently. They talked about storage, about drainage, about what was underneath their land, as well as on top of it. Clem Duval had more work than he could handle, and he brought in another man from Coaldale to help. Ray Eberly put in drainage tile on the low northeast corner of his land that fall. He'd figured out the slope himself, walking it the way Mabel had shown him, and when she drove past in October, she could see the fresh clay turned up along the line he'd run. She didn't slow down. She had somewhere to be. That winter, Mabel sat at the kitchen table with the brown notebook open and went through it from the beginning. The early sketches from the year before Gideon died, when it had been a shared project in theory rather than a real one. The pages from the Lethbridge Library. Clem's notes in his own handwriting, which she'd copied in because she wanted them preserved. The crop records from 3 seasons. The rainfall records she'd kept herself because the nearest official station was 12 miles away, and she didn't entirely trust it. June was 7 now and could read, and sometimes she sat at the other end of the table doing her own writing. Schoolwork, or letters to Edith Gould's granddaughter who had moved to Calgary. She wrote with the same serious focus Gideon had brought to things, the same quality of settling into a task and staying with it. Mabel watched her for a moment. Then she turned back to the notebook and started writing up a proper record of the drainage system, the tile layout, the depths, the materials, the problems she'd encountered, and how she'd worked around them. Not because anyone had asked for it, but because it seemed like the kind of thing that should exist somewhere other than in her own memory. The thing about a drought, Gideon had told her once, is that it's only a disaster if you don't see it coming, and you can almost always see it coming if you're watching the right things. She had been watching, she had written it all down. Outside, the temperature was dropping toward 20 below, and the fields were under snow, and the holding pond at the south end of the leased strip was frozen solid, waiting for spring the way the land always waited, not impatiently, not with urgency, just with the particular certainty of something that knows what it is and what comes next. In Harwick, the talk at Olson's on Thursday mornings had moved on to other things, the way talk always does. But sometimes, when someone drove past the old Cutter Slough on the East Road, they'd look at the field and the neat row of drainage outfalls, along the fence line and the south pond with its pump house, sitting quiet in the winter stillness, and they'd think about what it had looked like before. Mostly they thought about water and where it came from and what it was worth. That was what Mabel had wanted them to think about, though she never would have put it that way herself. She wasn't in the business of teaching lessons. She was in the business of farming land that everyone else had decided wasn't worth farming, and doing it well enough that the question of whether she could stopped being interesting a long time ago. She closed the notebook and put it back in the glove box of the Ford the next morning when she drove out to check on the south pond. June stayed home with Puddle. The road was empty in both directions, which was how Mabel liked it most mornings. Just the truck and the cold and the long flat country spreading out on every side, and somewhere underneath all of it, in the dark and the gravel and the slow press of groundwater moving through the earth, the thing she had built was still working.